Real estate prices going down, record high gas and food prices, and rising interest rates. So how are all these variables affecting debtors? Scott Terrio is here to discuss it, starting right now.
This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Scott Terrio is back. Scott, how are you doing today?
Good, Doug. Thanks.
So today's question, there's only one question, and that is, what's happening? How is all these things happening in the economy affecting the people that you and I meet?
I believe that's called an open-ended question.
It's an open-ended question.
Which is meant to get your subject talking,
exactly.
Which is never a problem with me
anyway. It's never been an issue. So, and I already spelled out, what's going on in the world. I mean, we're recording this in June of 2022. Interest rates are going up. Inflation is high. Gas prices are high. Food, there's a whole bunch of mess. So what are the kind of things you are seeing right now?
Well, so I think it's been an interesting year so far here. We're coming off 2 years of a generational economic shutdown from COVID. Then we've got interest rates finally going back up, fairly rapidly, and you could argue whether they should have started earlier or whatever. But this is what's happening now, and there's not much end in sight to that, especially the guidance from the U.S. and Europe. And you also have inflationary pressures which we haven't seen since I think the 70s or 80s. So I was referring to this as the toxic trifecta when I was talking to myself this weekend and making notes on this in my head. And those are three big whammies when you look at all that happening in one very short time period, and it affects everybody.
Yeah, and obviously, I guess if you're super rich, it affects you less than if you're the normal person. But so let's talk about this from the point of view of the normal person then. And Ted and I have talked about this already over the last few episodes. That I used to have to put $100 of gas into my car a week. Now I got to put in $150 or $200 or whatever. My grocery bill is higher, the whole bit. Yeah. So are you seeing that reflected in how people are using debt?
Yes, absolutely. I in the last month, the 20 or 30 new clients that I've spoken to have all mentioned inflation, and that's not a word we'd heard at all for the past, I don't know how many years, maybe all of the years I've been doing this work, 13 or 14 years, because it hasn't been an issue. And so, inflation, especially when it's really going up rapidly, is something people feel. Right. And we go through people's budgets with them in depth. Like when you call us and, maybe not the first meeting, but sometimes the first meeting, oftentimes the first meeting. And we go through their monthly expense budget with them in detail. And so, boy, you want to see inflation. That's where you'll see it, and it affects groceries. It affects, it affects like you said, the gas you put in your car. And I'll give you an example of this in a minute, but, it affects any kind of consumer spending, of which is probably a third to, 40, 50% of your monthly budget. And that's a big hurt for people, leaving the rich people out of this. The average Joe is, you can ask anybody on the street about inflation and they will tell you exact examples of what they have seen, because that's what they live every day.
Yeah. And it's obvious. You go to the store and that, pack of chips you used to buy that was this big, well, now it's less big and it costs more money. So it's
right. And especially when, we've already had inflation for a month or so. So now people are starting to see it over and over. It isn't just, the one trip to the store, the one fill up of gas. People are talking about it without my prompting. I mean, they just say, well, with inflation, I can't, it was bad enough. I've been dragging this debt around with me for 5 years and now I got to play, so you're hearing it very anecdotally from people. And we never heard that before.
Yeah. And we've always had inflation, but it was small enough that you didn't notice.
Or we had the housing version, which is not the same, right? Housing unaffordability, that issue is different, right? And so that took more time. even though it's terrible, people got more attuned to it over time, right? Being, expensive to live in the city, expensive to live anywhere in Canada. But the inflation thing has hit so hard so fast that it's really what's on everybody's minds right now.
Yeah, we've had asset price inflation for many years, the real estate market. And if you own an asset, this is great. My house is going up in value. Now and of course, it wasn't really going up in value. It was an inflationary thing, but we can have that discussion another day too. Whereas now it's the price I got to pay at the grocery store. That's a real thing. That affects you every day.
Well, and house prices dropping and real estate dropping is something else everybody's noticing too, right? So really there's 4 factors here maybe that, it's almost a bit of a perfect storm situation right now. So, and again, back to the gas example, if you live outside of a big center, suburbs and smaller towns or smaller cities are set up for cars. And so I have a lot of sympathy for people who are, all of a sudden they're paying $200 more a month in gas or more, because they don't have a lot of choice. Like transit is inefficient. And so it's, to ask somebody, well, just take transit. Well, now you're engaging their time. So on a Saturday, instead of running to 2 stores in 2 hours, you're probably taking 5 hours if you're using transit. So it's not really an option. And so people are tied into that inflationary increase of gas when they don't live in any kind of an urban center, right? So it's hard.
Yeah, it's hard to go to IKEA or Costco on your bicycle and bring back a big, huge, thing.
A 10-foot long box that weighs 400 pounds on your back, right? So, so I think as an example, I was looking at this weekend. So a family of 4 making $5,600 a month in net income, let's say. Doesn't matter where they live really, but so say their rent is $2,000, because that's probably realistic. Their car payment is $650. And instead of putting $300 in the car, they're putting $550 or $600 in the car now. So all of a sudden you're up to about $1,400 just for the car. So $2,000 for rent, $1,400 now for the car. Your groceries, which were $700, are now $900, and I'm probably being generous here. Utilities maybe haven't gone up, but minimum payments on your debt have gone up because rates are going up. So now you have the effect of rates, because if you have lines of credit, and like 30% of the debt that clients present to us is probably line of credit debt versus credit cards, payday loans, taxes, whatever, and those have gone up. So you throw all that in together and you have an inflationary plus an interest rate rise effect, and it's costing you several $100 a month more. And we read polls and surveys and studies all the time about how close Canadians are to the edge and they're living paycheck to paycheck. Well, now all of a sudden you're paying $600-700 a month more than you were before. And that is a major impact that I think is going to really manifest itself in the next 6 to 12 months in this country.
Yeah. And the biggest number on your list was housing. And if I rent a place and I've got a 1-year lease, well, the rent hasn't changed in a year. It hasn't affected me. If I've got a 5-year fixed rate mortgage, it hasn't affected me. But if I'm planning to move, then, even with rent controls, well, if I move to a different place, my rent goes up. And
especially if you've lived somewhere a long time.
Then it could be doubling.
If you've lived somewhere like for 5 or 10 years in this city or anywhere, and frankly in Canada right now, you're going to have major sticker shock when you move, unless you intentionally move further away, in which of course brings all kinds of other impacts to it, right?
Yeah, the problem with moving further away is now your transportation costs go up.
Yep.
So
it's very hard to balance it, right? Like you're trapped in this, housing, interest rate rising, inflation situation, which is just all coming at once.
Yeah, and it's easy to say, well, you should be taking transit. You've already highlighted the fact that, it is less efficient in a lot of cases. I mean, if you're going from Yonge and Bloor down to Yonge and King, then sure, the subway's quicker than driving. You hop on the subway and you're good. Yeah. But over the last 2 years, people have been reluctant to take transit because, well, I'm going to catch the virus if I'm packed in with people. And now that you don't have to wear a mask when you're on public transit, so maybe I feel a little bit safer driving, but the driving is more expensive. So there's no easy answers. And if you've got kids that you have to
I was just going to say, if you're dragging kids around, forget all of that, right? If your kids both have soccer on a Thursday night at different fields somewhere, how do you do that with transit, right? So we're back to the car thing, because I often bash cars because of the expense they put on people, but I get it myself. I totally get it. And if there's no way around gas, like there's no gas deals. Even if you go on gasdeals.ca, you're saving a marginal amount of money really compared to what you were paying before. So
yeah, it's not easy. So let's go into the whole debt discussion then. So,
sure.
And specifically the different types of debt. So we've talked about credit cards, and you're right, their interest rates were already at 20%, so they haven't really changed. So that hasn't had a direct effect on people. But things like lines of credit and installment loans, we are seeing a big difference there. So what are you seeing in that world?
So let me address both of those in turn. So because Canadians have had a lot of consumer debt for a long time, like 5 to 10 years, a lot of what they have done as a tactic is to shift credit card balances onto lines of credit because it's half the interest or much less anyway. And so you're going from 18.5% interest or high 20s if it's retail cards to 10 or 12% or whatever, or maybe lower. And so what's happened there is now they've made a good move there, but now rates are going up and lines of credit float with rates. So your credit card balance that you just shifted over is now higher because the line of credit rate has gone up with the rising rates. And so if you have more than one line of credit, you will feel that in your pocket. So even though you made a smart move, well, that was when rates were low and were staying low. So now they're not. And so that has happened and backfired to a certain extent on people, although they're still in better shape. The bigger issue from a trend standpoint is the installment loans.
So just before we get to the installment loans, let me emphasize the point you just made there on the lines of credit. Sure. So you're exactly right. We've seen that shift over many years, and it made perfect sense. My line of credit at the bank was like a 5% interest rate. My credit card was 19%. It was a no-brainer. Use the line of credit, pay off the credit card. But the line of credit carries a variable interest rate. And if the rate goes from 5% to 7%, okay, that's only 2%. What's the big deal? No, it's 2 over 5. That's a 40% increase in the interest you're paying. And so unless your paycheck has gone up by 40%, it's a massive number. And that could be a unsecured line of credit. It could be a variable rate mortgage. And I understand a lot of variable rate mortgages have a fixed payment. The interest rate's going up. You're paying less in principal. It resets on a regular basis. But one way or the other, you're paying a lot more, and it's completely out of control. So that's the line of credit side of things. Tell me about installment loans then.
Right. So installment loans have grown massively in a nutshell. 3-4 years ago, we used to see an installment loan every month, maybe,
And let's define our terms.
Yeah. Here. And I'll tell you what I mean by an installment loan is one of these, $3,000, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 loans that are typically given out either by payday lenders because they shifted their business model a bit back a few years ago to that, or by the sort of secondary lenders of the world, not the big banks, but and they're at 48% interest generally. So it's a big number. It's not your $1,200 payday loan. It's a $3,000, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 loan, and it's at a massive interest rate. And we're seeing those commonly now. I see them every week, sometimes multiple times in a week, meeting with new people. And I've even seen several instances where they are the majority creditor in a consumer debt scenario that I'm presented with by a person. So these things have become fairly common. And if you think how bad a deal they are and how common that is becoming, it's getting a little bit disturbing. Oftentimes, the reason people are getting these is because of desperation. So when people say, well, why would you take a loan out at 10 grand at 48%? Well, because you have to. People don't have family supports to fall back on, the unfortunate people. And so therefore, if suddenly you have a big expense and you're maxed out on credit and you have damaged credit in the first place, you got nowhere to go because nobody else is going to give you 10 grand. Your bank's not going to do it. So you go as a solution to a problem. And of course, you're not thinking right. You're not getting good advice. Certainly the lenders aren't telling you, well, you're going to pay $11,000 to borrow $9,000. They don't come out and express that to you while you're sitting in the chair for the sales pitch. So people end up in these things, and sometimes it's an effort to consolidate, which of course it's consolidating 18% at 48 doesn't make sense, but people are desperate and they think it's a good idea, and maybe they are not as financially literate as they should be. But we're seeing this all the time now.
Yeah, and let's unpack that a bit, because you're right. You go on Twitter and people go, "Wow, you must be you're financially illiterate. How could you possibly sign a deal like that?" Well, you already gave us an example. Somebody who's got a, paycheck of X, and now all of their expenses have gone up by more than X. So I'm short. So what do I do? I still have to pay rent. Oh, and the car broke down. My kid needs braces. I have to do this. I have to do that. I was off
your
work.
Dog got sick. It's stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Like,
I was
you're
off
not going to
work.
shoot your dog because it got sick. You're going to find the $5,000 you need for the surgery, right? These are real life examples of things going wrong that people don't have the money for, right?
And very common. And, we've just come through a couple of years where people weren't able to work. Their, company was shut down. And so I still had to pay
or your
rent.
spouse's income was affected, right? So you might have just come off 24 months of 40% less income than your family had. Like, guess what? You've run your debt up.
Yep.
Right.
And
So we're just emerging from a period here, an unprecedented period where a lot of Canadians who were kind of okay on their debt aren't, because of the whole COVID shutdown thing. And now you got inflation and rates going up.
Yeah, and
it's like
in the old days,
it's like tossing somebody into a fire. It's,
right. And in the old days, I'd go to my bank and say, "Hey, things are getting better. I'm back to work. Can you loan me $10,000?" And they'd give you a loan, a term loan. But now the banks are like, "Yeah, you know what? $10,000, it's not worth it. Even though interest rates have come up, the rates are still so low. We can't make any money if we have to actually write the paper for a loan."
Especially if your credit profile is already hurt, right?
It's not perfect.
They take 10 seconds to look at your report and go, "Nope, I don't think so."
Yeah, if you need $10,000 from a bank, they say, "Here's a credit card." Because that's easy. They're, much less paperwork, much less administrative. And of course, the interest rate is massive. So I think we want to emphasize the point that people are turning to these secondary lenders who are not the chartered banks because they have no perceived choice. Now, maybe they do have a choice if they, thought it through more. But when you're stuck with this major bill, I got to get the car fixed or else I can't get to work. And I'm already maxed out on my credit cards and the bank won't give me a loan. Well, what am I supposed to do? These other guys are there. They're willing to lend.
And that's the other thing. Sometimes these emergencies are time pressure, right? Like, it's not like you have an emergency. Well, I can just fix the car 6 months from now. No, you have to get around, or the dog's sick, or, my garage caved in or something, right? So oftentimes the desperation also has a very time sensitive element to it. Right. And so, of course, hey, you walk into my place to get a $10,000 loan. Guess what? I'd be an idiot if I couldn't sell you that. So, a lot of it's sales based on pressure and based on real life scenarios that people have no other options to go to for.
Yeah. And we always say to people, make sure you read the agreement before you sign it and all the rest of it. But in a lot of cases, it's, look, I need that money.
Easy to say, harder to do. And we're not going to mention any names of companies here on this broadcast. For a couple of reasons. Number one, there's lots of them. So, picking on one it doesn't really serve any purpose. It's so widespread now that, there may be a few big players, but it's happening very broadly.
I pulled up the financial statements of one of the big players, and, their earnings per share doubled between 20 and 2021. Their revenue growth, which was 7% in 2020, was 26% in 2021, and their annual dividend per share went up considerably too. So,
which is also why they will participate in proposals.
Yep.
Because they're making money, right?
Yep.
So yes, they have to write off some. Okay, fine. But they vote yes on proposals because, they're making money.
Yep.
The business model works. And so they can afford to write off a bad debt here or there.
Yeah. And in most cases, in a consumer proposal, if the debtor is offering more than what they would have got, paid in or gotten into bankruptcy, the creditor's going, yeah, okay, you know what? We will take that deal. So
business decision. Yeah.
Yeah. It's absolutely a business decision. So that's, I guess, the prime reason we are seeing a lot more of these installment loans. And it's, the banks don't want to be in that business because, the big bank can't write a loan at 43%. That would be in all the news and they'd be trashed. So these secondary lenders are doing it. They're pretty sophisticated. They know exactly how to do it.
Well, and the big banks don't need to do it because of their mortgage their mortgage book, right? I mean, they have an entirely different setup than these outfits do. So they don't really need to be into that, right?
Well, and so you mentioned mortgages.
Mm-hmm.
So you can only have a mortgage if you own a house.
Mm-hmm.
We, for the last few years, have had virtually zero clients coming in to file a bankruptcy or a consumer proposal that own a house because, of course, the house went up by $100,000 last Tuesday. And so even if I've got $50,000 of credit card debt, my house price has gone up so much.
In the past couple of years, you could have run up 10 grand a month in credit card debts and still easily cleared it by the gains in your home
and
equity.
It didn't matter where you bought the house, what you paid for it, how over levered you were. Everything worked out until, here we are now. And it was, Nazma Ali was on the podcast a couple of months ago, and she said she started noticing it mid-February of this year, 2022. That's when kind of the peak seemed to have happened. And certainly the stats now will show that house prices have certainly gone down over the last few months. We are still not seeing a whole lot of homeowners. Do you expect that to change?
Well, yes, I do. So let me address this one then. So I have heard from probably a dozen homeowners in the last couple of months, let's say. Okay. I had not heard from more than a couple of homeowners in the previous 2 years. That to me tells me something, and they're scattered geographically. So there's no pattern there if anybody's looking. It's just homeowners are feeling the pinch. Homeowners are also out in society. And if you're out in society, doing work or whatever, you hear talk of real estate, just like you said, just like Nazma was saying, any realtor will tell you, right? And it's like real estate has replaced weather as small talk in this country. And Canadians were always great weather small talkers, but that's been the talk on everybody's lips. And so once it starts to turn down, just like it did in 17, 18, it becomes talk again for different reasons. And so some of it's self-fulfilling prophecies, but people get nervous. They start to call us and say, well, okay, I got a house and I got some equity. And, there was a guy that phoned me, he's in his 60s, and he's got a bunch of consumer debt. So homeowners, as you know, Doug, most of our homeowners profile, even though there's very few of them, they tend to have a lot more consumer debt than renters. And there's reasons for that we've gone into before, trappings of the house and whatnot. But they're starting to think, okay, well, my home equity is starting to drop a little, and the value, a house down the street just sold for way less than it would have 2 months ago. And people start to think, right? And so instead of things just going up and people not worrying about it, they start to think. So they start to look into things, research things, call us. And most of the homeowners I've spoken to haven't filed because I've said to them, okay, well, we'll do we'll do a plan for the interim, and you can, maybe file a proposal down the road or something like that. But the point is, homeowners can put things off longer. They where their houses are increasing or decreasing. So we will see the homeowner bankruptcy index increase from whatever 1.5-2% it is right now. I don't know where it'll go to. I think the highest it ever was high 20s, and I expect to see that. But over time, as homeowners run out of options, rates are going up, inflation. Probably the only positive right now in the economic front is jobs. And so, but we're going to see it happen, but it's going to take longer than it would for renters to call us, just because, again, even with things in decline and things being tough as they are right now, it'll still take homeowners longer before they really need to phone us and do something about their consumer debt.
Yeah, and you're talking about the Hoyes Michalos Homeowners Bankruptcy Index. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. There you go, the HBI. And I believe it got pretty close to a third back in 2011. And
2011, I think it was 27 something, or
it got, it might have even hit over 30, but it was, and what that shows is the percentage of our clients who own a home at the time they file a bankruptcy or consumer proposal. So back,
and we're only in Ontario, so it's an Ontario measure,
stat.
Right?
So you go back 10, 15 years, well, house prices weren't as high. Maybe I had 5 or 10,000 of equity, but if I got 50,000 in unsecured debt, credit cards and whatnot, proposal makes sense, keep my house, deal with the debts. Well, now the people who are calling us have $300,000 worth of equity, and you're certainly not going to go bankrupt and give up $300,000 in equity to deal with $50,000 in debt. I guess the other factor to this is that the people who live in the GTA, like Toronto proper, if they bought their house in the last 2, 3, 4 years, well, it's up in value. But you and I now are talking to a lot of people who are far outside the GTA, even up north, Sudbury,
Right.
Sault Ste. Marie,
Yes.
Timmins, and house prices there are a lot less than they are in the GTA. They didn't go up by 400% last Tuesday. They are higher than they were a few years ago, but the equity they've got is a lot less. Those are probably the people who are going to be contacting us more over the next few months, and it'll be the Toronto people next year.
I think so too. And some of it is age, right? Like if you're 60, like this gentleman that phoned me, your horizon is different, right? Like you're going to be retiring fairly soon versus someone who's in their 20s or 30s. So you're starting to think, okay, well, I only now have 150,000 equity or 200. That's my retirement fund. And house prices are dropping. So I had this one guy who was saying, well, if I wait 6 months, I'm only going to have whatever. Well, maybe not, right? But this is how people are going to start to think, right? It depends on what your timeline, your life left in the economic forum is if it's 10 or 15 years or 20 instead of 40 or 50, then you're going to approach things differently. And I think people in that situation will call us before others. And so some of it is a little bit more subtleties of the situation, which drives people to phone us who own homes. But we're certainly starting to see that where, we wouldn't have heard any of that in the last 2 years prior to this situation going on.
Yeah. And there's a cash flow component to that too. If I'm retired, I've got my pension, hopefully, maybe, but I've also
time cash flow component.
Right. Hopefully I've also got some investments. Well, we all know what the market's kind of done in, February, March, April, May, June of
that's the other thing, right? Like if your RRSP or whatever just got hammered, right? This is the other thing people are talking about. Well, how much is your RSP worth? And they'll say a lot less than it was 2 months ago, right? So all of these things are weighing on people's minds, right? And so that's why it's kind of a perfect storm, because we didn't even mention the equities markets being down. So if you've got 4 or 5 factors all thrown at people at once here, that's what starts people thinking where they weren't thinking before, right? Because they were just kind of, okay, I'm going along, I'm not doing great maybe, but I'm not doing bad, right? But now things are starting to impact their thinking. They're starting to look down the road a bit more at what the future is going to look like, and they'll pick up the phone and they'll call us.
So you're right. My income, my investments are down, my costs are up. It's kind of the perfect bad storm. So let's close the show then with whatever practical advice you would like to leave people with in these very challenging and very volatile times. What message do you want to leave people with?
Well, I think you want to get, we always say this, but you want to get your house in order. You want to think about, okay, if things are declining quickly, housing and the stock and my investments, as long as you have enough cash flow to be able to solve a problem, then you might be able to do something in terms of a consumer proposal. I'm going to talk specifically about our business here. Why wouldn't I? A proposal allows you to keep your house. The 2 or 3 people that I spoke to most recently with houses, and the older guy included, they're probably going to do proposals. Maybe not right now because it doesn't make sense yet, but they're going to, because the older guy, for example, doesn't want to carry that consumer debt into retirement. That is a big thing, right? You want to be clean when you're ended up on pension and using the equity from your sale of your home to retire to wherever you're retiring to. So I think you want to think about what can I maximize in my situation, right? If I've got a home with equity, or if I don't have a home, but I want to get this debt, my consumer debt, out of the way, because if I drag it around for 10 more years at interest, I'm going to pay $40,000 instead of the 20 that I owe. So again, I think we're back to call somebody who can walk you through options. Again, half the people that call us don't file with us because we tell them not to, because they don't need to. So it's not like you phone me, you're doing something. When you phone someone of a professional industry, hopefully you're phoning them just to get advice and make a decision. And that's, I think, where we're at, because we could be hitting a recession here. Some people say that we are going to, for sure. There's talk of stagflation. I'm not an economist, but those things aren't good. And I leaned on my friend Frances Donald from Manulife on this question this weekend. And she was telling me about, okay, well, stagflation, there's several definitions of it, but whichever one you choose to look at, we're either in it now or it's coming. And so, you've got stagflation, meaning low growth, and sorry.
Yeah, the low growth and the incomes are not keeping up with it.
Exactly. So basically the problem is the economy's going nowhere.
Yeah, and low growth, high prices. It's the worst possible thing.
You throw inflation in, and we're back to the examples, the real life examples that we gave earlier of people are stuck and they can't make any progress. And in fact, they're probably in a worse position now than before. So before you spend 6 or 12 months spending that $600 or $700 more a month that we were talking about in our scenario and burning it up, maybe you should be speaking to somebody and saying, look, what can I do to get out of this? Because one of the things that it's hard to diagnose your own issues, right? Like when someone phones me in 10 minutes, I can tell them, well, here's what you should be doing, right? And it's partly based on experience, but it's also because I'm not them. And so if you want an objective view of your situation, it's probably not as complicated as you've made it in your mind to be. A lot of this is psychology. So if you can get somebody from an outside standpoint to look at your situation, usually they can give you a fairly objective view of something and tell you that you don't have to keep spinning your wheels. Because I think the longer people go in this situation of spending an extra $600-700 a month because of inflationary pressures and all these other issues, you're going to be in a worse situation now than you are or 2 years from now than you are now. And oftentimes it takes people 12 to 24 months before they actually come and see us. And that intervening 12 and 24 months puts them into a much worse spot than they were in before. So earlier is always better. Get somebody to give you some advice.
Yep, I totally agree with that. And my concluding comment would be, well, now is the time to, if you possibly can, be deleveraging, getting out of debt. For the last 10 years, the correct answer has been borrow as much as you possibly can because interest rates are going down, asset prices are going up, and the leverage is the way to do it. Well, I think it's the
now leverage is your enemy.
Leverage is your enemy. What you want to be doing is reducing debt if at all possible. Yeah. So you got that second car that you don't drive anymore because you can't afford the price of gas. Well, now's the time to sell it, use the money to pay off debt. And I realize that a lot of people watching don't have anything to sell. They don't have any extra assets. They can't do that, which goes back to your point that, okay, well, then you probably need to be talking to someone about how to deal with
everybody's scenario is different, right? And there's a certain set of circumstances that everybody calls us with. And so, if you've got somebody who's seen all kinds of these things speaking to you, it's easier to diagnose that. And oftentimes the solution's not nearly as bad as you think it might be.
Yep. And the law says we are not allowed to charge a fee for that initial consultation. So you give us a call and we'll walk you through the options. Scott Terrio, thanks very much for being here. We'll touch base with you again and see how the world has progressed. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Doug.
That was our show for today. I will put links to what we talked about over on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like and subscribe button because I don't know, there's some algorithm or something. It really helps if you do that. Those of you who are listening on the podcasting, whatever your podcasting app is, same thing, please subscribe. New podcast every Saturday morning. So until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. Thanks for listening. That was Debt Free in 30.